There was a moment when Walt Disney had almost nothing. His animation company had collapsed. He was nearly broke. His first major cartoon character had been taken from him, and the people around him were beginning to wonder if he would ever succeed. Most men would have stopped. Walt Disney didn't. Instead, he sat down on a train, traveling from New York to California, and began drawing. A small mouse. Simple, almost ridiculous, but that little mouse would become one of the most recognizable characters in human history. And the story of Walt Disney isn't really about a mouse. It's about something much harder to explain. How does a man keep believing in an idea when reality keeps telling him he's wrong? Disney failed in business, lost control of characters he created, risked everything on projects people thought were insane, and nearly destroyed his company trying to build a theme park nobody believed would work. Yet somehow he kept dreaming, and eventually the world began dreaming with him. This is the story of Walt Disney, not the legend, the man behind it.
The boy who learned to imagine. Walt Disney was born on December 5th, 1901, in Chicago, Illinois, but his childhood was far removed from the glamorous world he would eventually create. His family moved to a farm near Marceline, Missouri when Walt was young, and Marceline mattered because years later, Disney would describe those childhood memories as some of the happiest of his life. The small town, the trains passing through, the farms, the streets, the people, the feeling of a simpler America. He didn't know it at the time, but he was collecting memories, images, sounds, emotions. Years later, pieces of that childhood would appear inside his films, and eventually inside Disneyland itself. But Walt's imagination didn't develop in a vacuum. His father was demanding. Money was tight. Walt eventually found work delivering newspapers before school. He would wake up in the early hours of the morning, deliver papers, go to school, and continue working afterward. It wasn't an easy childhood, but something unusual was happening. While other children saw ordinary things, Walt saw stories. A train wasn't just a train, it was movement, adventure, possibility. A farm wasn't just a farm, it was a world.
And drawings weren't just drawings, they could become alive. As a teenager, Walt became fascinated with art and animation. He studied drawing, experimented with cartoons, and eventually found work creating advertisements and animations. But there was one problem. Walt didn't just want a job, he wanted to build something of his own. So in 1922, he created a company called Laugh-O-Gram Films in Kansas City. For a brief moment, it looked like the dream was becoming real. Then everything collapsed. The company went bankrupt. Walt was left with almost nothing. But failure did something strange to him. It didn't convince him that the dream was impossible. It convinced him that he needed a bigger dream. In 1923, Walt Disney left for California. He had very little money, but he carried something more valuable, a belief that he could build something nobody had built before. He just didn't know how much it was going to cost him. Losing everything he had created. California was supposed to be the beginning. Instead, it became another lesson in failure. Walt and his brother Roy started the Disney Brothers Studio. They began producing animated films. One of their early successes was a series called the Alice Comedies. For the first time, Disney's name was beginning to matter. The studio was growing. Money was coming in, and then Walt created a character named Oswald the Lucky Rabbit. Oswald became successful, but Walt soon discovered something devastating. He didn't actually own the character. The distributor controlled the rights, and when Walt traveled to New York to negotiate a better contract, he discovered that his distributor had taken control of Oswald. Even worse, some of Walt's animators had been hired away. The character he had created was no longer his. The company he had built was suddenly vulnerable. Imagine spending years creating something, only to discover that you don't control it. For many people, that would have been the breaking point. For Walt, it became a turning point. On the train ride back to California, Walt sat alone with the loss. No studio, no character, no guarantee any of this would ever work. And somewhere in that quiet, rattling carriage, an idea emerged. A mouse. He first considered names like Mortimer,
but his wife, Lillian, reportedly preferred Mickey. Mickey Mouse was born. In 1928, Disney released Steamboat Willie, and something changed. For the first time, audiences weren't simply watching animation, they were experiencing personality, sound, movement, character. Mickey wasn't just a drawing, he felt alive. The little mouse became an international sensation, but Walt Disney wasn't satisfied. Mickey Mouse had proved that audiences would follow him. Now, Walt wanted to prove something even bigger. He wanted animation to do what nobody believed it could do, tell a feature-length story, and that idea was considered insane.
The craziest gamble in Hollywood. By the early 1930s, Walt Disney had become successful. But success created a dangerous temptation. Stop. Play it safe. Keep making what already works. Walt did the opposite. He wanted to make a full-length animated feature. Something around an hour and a half. Hollywood insiders didn't think it would work. Some called it Disney's folly. The risk was enormous. The project became Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, and Walt poured almost everything into it. Money, time, people, his reputation. The project consumed years of work. There were moments when even people close to Walt questioned whether it could be finished. The budget kept growing. The pressure became enormous. If Snow White failed, the consequences could destroy the studio. But Walt had discovered something during his years of failure. The bigger the vision, the more people will tell you that you're crazy. That doesn't automatically mean they're wrong. In December 1937, Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs premiered, and the impossible happened. It was a massive success. Audiences laughed, cried, and watched animated characters carry an emotional story for an entire feature film. Animation was no longer being treated as a novelty. It had become a serious storytelling medium. Disney followed with films such as Pinocchio, Fantasia, Dumbo, and Bambi. But success didn't make Walt's life easier. The studio faced enormous pressures. In 1941, his own animators went on strike. People who had helped build his dream, turning against the man who built it. It cracked something in him that never fully healed. Then, World War II disrupted the entertainment industry entirely. The studio produced government-related work and propaganda films just to stay afloat. Money became tight, and Walt's dream was again under pressure. But this time, he wasn't thinking only about cartoons. He was thinking about something much larger, something that had nothing to do with a screen at all. Building the impossible. The idea came from a simple observation. On weekends, Walt Disney would take his daughters to amusement parks. And while they rode the attractions, he would sit on a bench and wait, watching, alone. He noticed the rides were run down. The parks felt cheap. The parents looked bored. And he thought, why does the fun stop at a certain age? Why can't the adults step inside the story too? It wasn't a business plan yet. It was an ache. The feeling of sitting on the outside of something you wished you could share. But by now, Walt had already lost a company, lost a character, nearly lost his studio to Snow White, watched his own people walk out on strike. This next idea would risk more than any of those combined. Not just a film, not just a character, an entire physical world built from nothing that either worked the moment the gates opened or failed in front of everyone, all at once. There was no reshoot, no second premiere, just one opening day. Banks turned him down. Studio executives thought he'd lost his mind.
Walt mortgaged what he had, including his own life insurance policy, to help fund it. He even used television to help finance and promote the project through the Disneyland program, trading creative control for capital he couldn't raise any other way. Construction began in Anaheim, California, and on July 17, 1955, Disneyland opened. The first day was chaos. Attractions weren't finished. Asphalt was still wet. A gas leak forced part of the park to close. Attendance overwhelmed every plan they'd made. Reporters called it a disaster. But underneath the chaos,
something else was happening. Families were walking into Main Street. Children were running into Fantasyland. For the first time, people weren't watching Walt's imagination. They were standing inside it. Disneyland revealed something deeper about him. He wasn't interested in preserving the past. He was obsessed with building the future. That's why he created Tomorrowland. That's why he became fascinated with technology, transportation, and urban design. And eventually, he imagined something even more ambitious than a park. A planned community in Florida. The idea would become Walt Disney World. But Walt wouldn't live to see it finished. Because by the mid-1960s, his health was failing. And the man who had spent his entire life creating worlds was running out of time.
The dream outlived the dreamer. Walt Disney died on December 15th, 1966. He was 65 years old. He would never see Walt Disney World open. He would never see the company become the global entertainment empire it would eventually become. He would never know just how far his ideas would travel. But perhaps that's the most important part of his story. Walt Disney spent his life building things he would never fully see. A film takes years to create. A theme park takes years to build. A vision can take decades to become reality. And sometimes, the person who starts the dream doesn't live long enough to see where it ends. But that doesn't make the dream meaningless. It makes it bigger than the person who imagined it. Walt's greatest achievement wasn't Mickey Mouse. It wasn't Snow White. It wasn't Disneyland. It was creating a culture around imagination. He made people believe that stories could become worlds, that drawings could become characters, that technology could become entertainment, that a bench outside a rundown amusement park could become the seed of a place millions of people would one day walk into. And perhaps most importantly, he demonstrated what happens when you refuse to let repeated failure define your imagination. Because Walt Disney didn't have a perfect life. He wasn't successful every time. He wasn't always right. He faced financial problems, creative failures, business setbacks, conflict, exhaustion, and enormous risk. But he kept asking one question. What if? What if animation could become a feature film? What if a mouse could become a star? What if families could walk inside a story? What if the future could be designed instead of simply waited for? Those questions changed entertainment forever. The real lesson of Walt Disney. History often remembers people after the struggle is over. We see Disneyland. We see Mickey Mouse. We see the castles, the films, the billions of dollars. And then we assume the success was inevitable. It wasn't. Before there was Disneyland, there was a bankrupt animation company. Before Mickey became famous, there was Oswald, taken from him in a New York office. Before Snow White became a classic, there were people telling Walt that a full-length animated film was a foolish idea. Before the dream became reality, there was a man on a bench watching other people's families have fun, wondering why it had to stop at a certain age. And maybe that's the lesson. You don't need everyone to believe in your vision. Sometimes, you need to believe long enough for the vision to become visible. Walt Disney didn't wait for certainty. He moved forward with imagination. And that is difficult, because imagination makes you vulnerable. You have to see something before other people can see it. You have to invest in something before there is proof. You have to continue when failure makes your dream look foolish. But every great creation begins that way, as an idea that doesn't exist yet. So maybe the question isn't, is my dream realistic? Maybe the better question is, what could become possible if I refused to give up on it? Because the world Walt Disney eventually built once existed only inside his mind. And that's where every great world begins, inside someone's imagination. If Walt Disney's story changed the way you see failure, dreams, or your own potential, you're exactly where you belong. Subscribe to Wisdom Everflow for more true stories from history that don't just inform you, they challenge you to see yourself differently. Until next time.